night was fine, came in her course to that space in the sky opposite my casement, and looked in at me through the unveiled panes. Her glorious gaze roused me. Awakening in the dead of night, I opened my eyes on her disco, silver white and crystal clear. It was beautiful, but too solemn. I half rose and stretched my arm to draw the curtain. Good God, what a cry! The night, its silence, its rest, was rent in twain by a savage, a sharp, a shrilly sound that ran from end to end of Thornfield Hall. My pulse stopped. My heart stood still. My stretched arm was paralyzed. The cry died and was not renewed. Indeed, whatever being uttered that fearful shriek could not soon repeat it. Not the wildest winged condor on the Andes could, twice in succession, send out such a yell from the cloud shrouding his ire. The thing delivering such utterance must rest ere it could repeat the effort. It came out of the third story, for it passed overhead. And overhead, yes, in the room just above my chamber ceiling, I now heard a struggle, a deadly one, it seemed from the noise, and a half-smothered voice shouted, "Help! Help! Help!" 3 times rapidly. "Will no one come?" it cried, and then, while the staggering and stamping went on wildly, I distinguished through blank and plaster, "Rochester! Rochester! For God's sake, come! A chamber door opened. Someone ran, or rushed along the gallery. Another step stamped on the flooring above, and something fell, and there was silence. I had put on some clothes. The horror shook all my limbs. I issued from my apartment. The sleepers were all aroused. Ejaculations, terrified murmurs sounded in every room. Door after door unclosed. One looked out, and another looked out. The gallery filled. "Where the devil is Rochester?" cried Colonel Dent. "I cannot find him in his bed." "Here, here," was shouted in return. "Be composed, all of you. I'm coming." And the door at the end of the gallery opened, and Mr. Rochester advanced with a candle. He had just descended from the upper story. One of the ladies ran to him directly. She seized his arm. It was Miss Ingram. "What awful event has taken place?" said she. "Speak. Let us know the worst at once." "All's right, all's right," he cried. "It's a mere rehearsal of much ado about nothing. Ladies, keep off, or I shall wax dangerous." And dangerous he looked. His black eyes darted sparks. Calming himself by an effort, he added, "A servant has had the nightmare. That is all. She's an excitable, nervous person. She construed her dream into an apparition, or something of that sort, no doubt, and has taken a fit with fright. Now then, I must see you all back into your rooms, for, till the house is settled, she cannot be looked after. Gentlemen, have the goodness to set the ladies the example. Miss Ingram, I am sure you will not fail in evincing superiority to idle terrors. Amy and Louisa, return to your nests like a pair of doves, as you are. Miss Dames, to the Dowager I expected to hear, namely my master's. Yes, sir. And the rest. Yes. Come out then, quietly. I obeyed. Mr. Rochester stood in the gallery, holding a light. I want you, he said. Come this way. Take your time and make no noise. My slippers were thin. I could walk the matted floor as softly as a cat. He glided up the gallery and up the stairs and stopped in the dark, low corridor of the fateful third story. I had followed and stood at his side. He held a key in his hand. Approaching one of the small black doors, he put it in the lock. He paused and addressed me again. Just give me your hand, he said. It will not do to risk a fainting fit. I put my fingers into his. Warm and steady was his remark. He turned the key and opened the door. I saw a room I remembered to have seen before, the day Mrs. Fairfax showed me over the house. It was hung with tapestry, but the tapestry was now looped up in one part, and there was a door apparent, which had then been concealed. The door was open. A light shone out of the room within. I heard thence a snarling, snatching sound, almost like a dog quarrelling. Mr. Rochester, putting down his candle, said to me, "Wait a minute," and he went forward to the inner apartment. A shout of laughter greeted his entrance, noisy at first, and terminating in Grace Pole's own goblin. Ha, ha! She, then, was there. He made some sort of arrangement, without speaking, though I heard a low voice address him. He came out and closed the door behind me. "Here, Jane," he said, and I walked round to the other side of the large bed, which, with its drawn curtains, concealed a considerable portion of the chamber. An easy chair was near the bedhead. A man sat in it, dressed with the exception of his coat. He was still, his head leaned back, his eyes were closed. Mr. Rochester held the candle over him. I recognized in his pale and seemingly lifeless face the stranger, Mason. I saw, too, that his linen on one side and one arm was almost soaked in blood. "Hold the candle," said Mr. Rochester, and I took it. He fetched a basin of water from the washstand. "Hold that," said he. I obeyed. He took the sponge, dipped it in, and moistened the corpse-like face. He asked for my smelling bottle and applied it to the nostrils. Mr. Mason shortly unclosed his eyes. He groaned. Mr. Rochester opened the shirt of the wounded man, whose arm and shoulder were bandaged. He sponged away blood, trickling fast down. "Is there immediate danger?" murmured Mr. Mason. "Pooh, no, a mere scratch. Don't be so overcome, man. Bear up. I'll fetch a surgeon for you now, myself. You'll be able to be removed by morning, I hope. Jane," he continued. "Sir, I shall have to leave you in this room with this gentleman for an hour, or perhaps 2 hours. You will sponge the blood as I do when it returns. If he feels faint, you'll put the glass of water on that stand to his lips, and your salts to his nose. You will not speak to him in any pretext. And, Richard, it will be at the peril of your life if you speak to her. Open your lips, agitate yourself, and I'll not answer for the consequences." Again, the poor man groaned. He looked as if he dared not move. Fear either of death or something else appeared almost to paralyze him. Mr. Rochester put the now bloody sponge into my hand, and I proceeded to use it as he had done. He watched me a second, then saying, "Remember, no conversation," he left the room. I experienced a strange feeling as the key grated in the lock, and the sound of his retreating steps ceased to be heard. Here then was I in the third story, fastened into one of its mystic plastic cells. Night around me, a pale and bloody spectacle under my eyes and hands. A murderess hardly separated from me by a single door. Yes, that was appalling. The rest I could bear, but I shuddered at the thought of Gracepool bursting out upon me. I must keep to my post, however. I must watch this ghastly countenance, these blue, still lips, forbidden to unclose, these eyes now shut, now opening, now wandering through the room, now fixing on me, and ever glazed with the dullness of horror. I must dip my hand again and again in the basin of blood and water, and wipe away the trickling gore. Amidst all this, I had to listen as well as watch, to listen for the movements of the wild beast or fiend in yonder side den. But since Mr. Rochester's visit, it seemed spellbound. All the night I heard but 3 sounds at 3 long intervals: a sharp creak, a momentary renewal of the snarling, canine noise, and a deep human groan. And this man I bent over, this commonplace, quiet stranger, how had he become involved in the web of horror, and why had the fury flown at him? What made him seek this quarter of this house at an untimely season, when he should have been asleep in bed? I had heard Mr. Rochester assign him an apartment below. What brought him here, and why, now, was he so tame under the violence of treachery done him? Why did he so quietly submit to the concealment Mr. Rochester enforced? Why did Mr. Rochester enforce this concealment? His guest had been outraged. His own life on a former occasion had been hideously plotted against, and both attempts he smothered in secrecy and sank in oblivion. When will he come? When will he come? I cried inwardly, as the night lingered and lingered, as my bleeding patient drooped, moaned, sickened, and neither day nor aid arrived. I had again and again held the water to Mason's white lips, again and again offered him the stimulating salts. My efforts seemed ineffectual. Either bodily or mental suffering, or loss of blood, or all 3 combined, were fast prostrating his strength. He moaned so, and looked so weak, wild, and lost, I feared he was dying, and I might not even speak to him. The candle, wasted at last, went out. As it expired, I perceived streaks of grey light edging the window curtains. Dawn was then approaching. Presently, I heard Pilot bark far below, out of his distant kennel in the courtyard. Hope revived. Nor was it unwarranted. In 5 minutes more, the grating key, the yielding lock, warned me my watch was relieved. It could not have lasted more than 2 hours. Many a week has seemed shorter. Mr. Rochester entered, and with him the surgeon he had been to fetch. "Now, Carter, be on the alert," he said to this last. "I give you but half an hour for dressing the wound, fastening the bandages, getting the patient downstairs, and all. But is he fit to move, sir?" "No doubt of it. It is nothing serious. He is nervous. His spirits must be kept up. Come, set to work." Mr. Rochester drew back the thick curtain, threw up the Holland blind, let in all the daylight he could, and I was surprised and cheered to see how far dawn was advanced. What rosy streaks were beginning to brighten the east. Then he approached Mason, whom the surgeon was already handling. "Now, my good fellow, how are you?" he asked. "She's done for me, I fear," was the faint reply. "Not a whit. Courage. This day fortnight you'll hardly be a pin in the worse for of it. You've lost a little blood, that's all. Carter, assure him there's no danger." "I could do that conscientiously," said Carter, who had now undone the bandages. Only I wish I could have got here sooner. He would not have bled so much. But how is this? The flesh on the shoulder is torn as well as cut. This wound was not done by a knife. There have been teeth here. She bit me, he murmured. She worried me like a tigress when Rochester got the knife from her. You should not have yielded. You should have grappled with her at once, said Mr. Rochester. But under such circumstances, what could one do? Returned Mason. Oh, it was frightful, he added, shuddering, and I did not expect it. She looked so quiet at first. I warned you, was his friend's answer. I said, be on your guard when you go near her. Besides, you might have waited till tomorrow and had me with you. It was mere folly to attempt the interview tonight, and alone. I thought I could have done some good. You thought. Yes, it makes me impatient to hear you. But, however, you have suffered, and are likely to suffer enough for not taking my advice. So, I'll say no more. Carter, hurry, hurry. The sun will soon rise, and I must have him off. Directly, sir. The shoulder is just bandaged. I must look to this other wound in the arm. She has had her teeth here too, I think. She sucked the blood. She said she'd drain my heart, said Mason. I saw Mr. Rochester shudder. A singularly marked expression of disgust, horror, hatred, warped his countenance, almost to distortion. But he only said, Come, be silent, Richard, and never mind her gibberish. Don't repeat it. I wish I could forget it, was the answer. You will, when you are out of the country, when you get back to Spanish Town. You may think of her as dead and buried, or rather, you need not think of her at all. Impossible to forget this night. It is not impossible. Have some energy, man. You thought you were as dead as a herring 2 hours since, and you are all alive and talking now. There, Carter is done with you, or nearly so. I'll make you decent in a trice. He was dressed now. He still looked pale, but he was no longer gory and sullied. Mr. Rochester then took his arm. Now, I am sure you can get on your feet, he said. Try. The patient rose. Carter, take him under the other shoulder. Be of good cheer, Richard. Step out. That's it. I do feel better, remarked Mr. Mason. I am sure you do. Now, Jane, trip on before us away to the back stairs and bolt the side passage door, and tell the driver of the post chaise you will see in the yard, or just outside, for I told him not to drive his rattling wheels over the pavement. To be ready. We are coming, and, Jane, if anyone is about, come to the foot of the stairs and hem. It was, by this time, 5:30, and the sun was on the point of rising. But I found the kitchen still dark and silent. The side passage door was fastened. I opened it with as little noise as possible. All the yard was quiet, but the gates stood wide open, and there was a post chaise, with horses ready harnessed, and driver seated on the box, stationed outside. I approached him, and said the gentlemen were coming. He nodded. Then I looked carefully around and listened. The stillness of the early morning slumbered everywhere. The gentlemen now appeared, Mason supported by Mr. Rochester, and the surgeon seemed to walk with tolerable ease. They assisted him into the chaise. Carter followed. Take care of him, said Rochester to the latter, and keep him at your house till he is quite well. I shall ride over in a day or two to see how he gets on. Richard, how is it with you? The fresh air revives me, Fairfax. Leave the window open on this side, Carter. There is no wind. Goodbye, Dick. Fairfax. Well, what is that? Let her be taken care of. Let her be treated as tenderly as may be. Let her... He stopped and burst into tears. I do my best, closed and barred the heavy yard gates. This done, he moved with slow step and abstracted air towards a door in the wall bordering the orchard. I, supposing he had done with me, prepared to return to the house. Again, however, I heard him call, "Jane." He had opened the portal and stood at it, waiting for me. "Come where there is some freshness for a few moments," he said. "That house is mere dungeon. Don't you feel it so?" "It seems to me a splendid mansion, sir." "The glamour of inexperience is over your eyes," he answered, "and you see it through a charmed medium. Now, here," he pointed to the leafy enclosure we had entered, "all is real, sweet, and pure." He strayed down a walk edged with box, with apple trees, pear trees, and cherry trees on one side, and a border on the other, full of all sorts of old-fashioned flowers, stocks, sweet williams, primroses, pansies, mingled with southernwood, sweet briar, and various fragrant herbs. "You have passed a strange night, Jane." "Yes, sir." "And it has made you look pale. Were you afraid when I left you alone with Mason?" "I was afraid of someone coming out of the inner room, but I had fastened the door. I had the key in my pocket. I should have been a careless shepherd if I had left a lamb, my pet lamb, so near a wolf's den, unguarded. You were safe." "Will Grace Poole live here still, sir?" "Oh, yes. Don't trouble your head about her. Put the thing out of your thoughts. Yet, it seems to me, your life is hardly secure while she stays. Never fear, I will take care of myself. Is the danger you apprehended last night gone by now, sir?" "I cannot vouch for that till Mason is out of England, nor even then. To live, for me, Jane, is to stand on a crater crust, which may crack and spew fire any day. But Mr. Mason seems a man easily led. Your influence, sir, is evidently potent with him. He will never set you at defiance or wilfully injure you." "Oh, no, Mason will not defy me, nor, knowing it, will he hurt me. But, unintentionally, he might in a moment, by one careless word, deprive me, if not of life, yet forever of happiness. Well, you too may injure me, yet I dare not show you where I am vulnerable, lest, faithful and friendly as you are, you should transfix me at once. If you have no more to fear from Mr. Mason than you have from me, sir, you are very safe. God grant it may be so. Here, Jane, is an arbour. Sit down." The arbour was an arch in the wall, lined with ivy. It contained a rustic seat. Mr. Rochester took it, leaving room, however, for me, but I stood before him. "Sit," he said. "The bench is long enough for two. You don't hesitate to take a place at my side, do you? Is that wrong, Jane?" I answered him by assuming it. To refuse would, I felt, have been unwise. "Now, my little friend, while the sun drinks the dew, I'll put a case to you, which you must endeavour to suppose your own. But first, look at me, and tell me you are at ease, and not fearing that I err in detaining you, or that you err in staying." "No, sir, I am content." "Well then, Jane, call to aid your fancy. Suppose you were no longer a girl, well reared and disciplined, but a wild boy, indulged from childhood upwards. Imagine yourself in a remote foreign land. Conceive that you there commit a capital error, no matter of what nature or from what motives, but one whose consequences must follow you through life, and taint all your existence. Mind, I don't say a crime. I am not speaking of shedding of blood, or any other guilty act, which might make the perpetrator amenable to the law. My word is error. The results of what you have done judgment approves. He paused for an answer, and what was I to say? Oh, for some good spirit to suggest a judicious and satisfactory response. Again, Mr. Rochester propounded his query. Is the wandering and sinful, but now rest-seeking and repentant man justified in daring the world's opinion in order to attach to him forever this gentle, gracious, genial stranger, thereby securing his own peace of mind and regeneration of life? Sir, I answered, a wanderer's repose or a sinner's reformation should never depend on a fellow creature. Men and women die, philosophers falter in wisdom, and Christians in goodness. If anyone you know has suffered and erred, let him look higher than his equals, for strength to amend and solace to heal. But the instrument, God who does the work, ordains the instrument. I have myself. I tell it to you without parable, being a worldly, dissipated, restless man, and I believe I have found the instrument for my cure in. He paused. The birds went on caroling, the leaves lightly rustling. I almost wondered they did not check their songs and whispers to catch the suspended revelation. But they would have had to wait many minutes. So long was the silence protracted. At last I looked up at the tardy speaker. He was looking eagerly at me. Little friend, said he, in quite a changed tone, with his face changed too, losing all its softness and gravity, and becoming harsh and sarcastic. You may have noticed my tender penchant for Miss Ingram. Don't you think if I married her, she would regenerate me with a vengeance? He got up instantly, went quite to the other end of the walk, and when he came back, he was humming a tune. Jane, Jane, said he, stopping before me, you are quite pale with your vigils. Don't you curse me for disturbing your rest. Curse you? No, sir. Shake hands in confirmation of the word. What cold fingers! They were warmer last night when I touched them at the door of the mysterious chamber. Jane, when will you watch with me again? Whenever I can be useful, sir. For instance, the night before I am married, I am sure I shall not be able to sleep. Will you promise to sit up with me to bear me company? To you I can talk of my lovely one. For now, you have seen her and know her. Yes, sir. She is a rare one, is she not, Jane? Yes, sir. A strapper, a real strapper, Jane. Big, brown and buxom, with hair just such as the ladies of Carthage must have had. Bless me, there's Dent and Lynn in the stables. Go in by the shrubbery through the wicket. As I went in one way, he went another, and I heard him in the yard saying cheerfully, Mason got the start of you all this morning. He was gone before sunrise. I rose at 4 to see him off. Chapter 20. I was summoned downstairs by a message that someone wanted me in Mrs. Fairfax's room. On repairing thither, I found a man waiting for me, having the appearance of a gentleman's servant. He was dressed in deep mourning, and the hat he held in his hand was surrounded with a crape band. I dare say you hardly remember me, miss, he said, rising as I entered. But my name is Leaven. I lived coachman with Mrs. Read when you were at Gateshead, 8 or 9 years since, and I live there still. Oh, Robert, how do you do? he was free, he returned to his old companions and habits. He was headstrong. His head was not strong. The knaves he lived amongst fooled him beyond anything I ever heard. He came down to Gateshead about 3 weeks ago and wanted Mrs. to give up all to him. Mrs. refused. Her means have long been much reduced by his extravagance. So he went back again, and the next news was that he was dead. How he died, God knows. They say he killed himself. I was silent. The tidings were frightful. Robert Leven resumed. Mrs. had been out of health herself for some time. She had got very stout, but was not strong with it, and the loss of money and fear of poverty were quite breaking her down. The information about Mr. John's death and the manner of it came too suddenly. It brought on a stroke. She was 3 days without speaking, but last Tuesday she seemed rather better. She appeared as if she wanted to say something, and kept making signs to my wife and mumbling. It was only yesterday morning, however, that Bessie understood she was pronouncing your name, and at last she made out the words, "Bring Jane. Fetch Jane Eyre. I want to speak to her." Bessie is not sure whether she is in her right mind, or speaks anything by the words, but she told Miss Reed and Miss Georgiana, and advised them to send for you. The young ladies put it off at first, but her mother grew so restless and said, "Jane, Jane," so many times, that at last they consented. I left Gateshead yesterday, and if you can get ready, miss, I should like to take you back with me early tomorrow morning. Yes, Robert, I shall be ready. It seems to me I ought to go. I think so too, miss. Bessie said she was sure you would not refuse, but I suppose you'll have to ask leave before you can get off. Yes, and I will do it now, and having directed him to the servants' hall, and recommended him to the care of John's wife, and to the attentions of John himself, I went in search of Mr. Rochester. He was not in any of the lower rooms. He was not in the yard, the stables, or the grounds. I asked Mrs. Fairfax if she had seen him. Yes, she believed he was playing billiards with Miss Ingram. To the billiard room I hastened. The click of balls and the hum of voices resounded thence. Mr. Rochester, Miss Ingram, the two Mrs. Eshton, and their admirers were all busied in the game. It required some courage to disturb so interesting a party. My errand, however, was one I could not defer. As I approached the master, where he stood at Miss Ingram's side, "Does that person want you?" she inquired of Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester turned to see who the person was. He made a curious grimace, one of his strange and equivocal demonstrations, threw down his cue, and followed me from the room. "Well, Jane," he said, as he rested his back against the schoolroom door, which he had shut. "If you please, sir, I want leave of absence for a week or two. What to do? Where to go?" "To see a sick lady who has sent for me." "What sick lady? Where does she live?" "At Gateshead in Shire." "Shire? That is 100 miles off. Who may she be that sends for people to see her that distance?" "Her name is Reed, sir. Mrs. Reed. Reed of Gateshead. There was a Reed of Gateshead, a magistrate. It is his widow, sir." "And what have you to do with her? How do you know her?" "Mr. Reed was my uncle, my mother's brother." "The deuce he was. You never told me that before. You always said you had no relations." "None that would own me, sir. Mr. Reed is dead, and his wife cast me off." "Why?" "Because I was poor and burdensome, and she disliked me." "And what can you do her?" "Nonsense, Jane. I would never think of running 100 miles to see an old lady who will, perhaps, be dead before you reach her. Besides, you say she cast you off." "Yes, sir, but that is long ago. wishes now. How long will you stay? As short a time as possible, sir. Promise me only to stay a week. I had better not pass my word. I might be obliged to break it. Mr. Rochester meditated. When do you wish to go? Early tomorrow morning, sir. Well, you must have some money. You can't travel without money, and I dare say you have not much. I have given you no salary yet. How much have you in the world, Jane? He asked, smiling. I threw out my purse. A meagre thing it was. 5 shillings, sir. He took the purse, poured the hoard into his palm, and chuckled over it, as if its scantiness amused him. Soon he produced his pocketbook. Here, said he, offering me a note. It was £50, and he owed me but 15. I told him I had no change. I don't want change, you know that. Take your wages. Mr. Rochester, I may as well mention another matter of business to you while I have the opportunity. Matter of business? I'm curious to hear it. You have as good as informed me, sir, that you are going shortly to be married. Yes. What then? In that case, sir, Adele ought to go to school. I'm sure you will perceive the necessity of it. To get her out of my bride's way, who might otherwise walk over her rather too emphatically. There's sense in the suggestion, not a doubt of it. Adele, as you say, must go to school. And you, of course, must march straight to the devil. I hope not, sir, but I must seek another situation somewhere. In course, he exclaimed, with a twang of voice and a distortion of features, equally fantastico and ludicrous. He looked at me some minutes. And old Madam Reed, or the missus, her daughters, will be solicited by you to seek a place, I suppose. No, sir, I am not on such terms with my relatives as would justify me in asking favours of them, but I shall advertise. You shall walk up the pyramids of Egypt, he growled. Promise me one thing. I'll promise you anything, sir, that I think I am likely to perform. Not to advertise, and to trust this quest of a situation to me. I'll find you one in time. I shall be glad so to do, sir, if you, in your turn, will promise that I and Adele shall both be safe out of the house before your bride enters it. Very well, very well. I pledge my word on it. You go tomorrow then? Yes, sir, early. Then you and I must bid goodbye for a little while. I suppose so, sir. And how do people perform that ceremony of parting, Jane? Teach me. I am not quite up to it. They say farewell. Very likely, but it is blank and cool. Farewell. How long is he going to stand with his back against that door? I asked myself. I want to commence my packing. The dinner bell rang, and suddenly away he bolted, without another syllable. I saw him no more during the day, and was off before he had risen in the morning. I reached the lodge at Gateshead about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 1st of May. I stepped in there before going up to the hall. It was very clean and neat. The ornamental windows were hung with little white curtains. The floor was spotless. The grate and fire irons were burnished, bright, and the fire burnt clear. Bessie sat on the hearth, nursing her last-born, and Robert and his sister played quietly in a corner. Bless you! I knew you would come, exclaimed Mrs. Levin, as I entered. Yes, Bessie, said I, after I had kissed her, and I trust I am not too late. How is Mrs. Reed? Alive still, I hope. Yes, she is alive, and more sensible and collected than she was. The doctor says she may linger a week or two yet, but he hardly thinks that she will finally recover. Has she mentioned me lately? She was talking of you only this morning, and wishing you would come, but she is sleeping now, or was 10 minutes ago, when I was up at the house. She 6 or 7. Will you rest yourself here an hour, miss, and then I will go up with you. Robert had entered, and Bessie laid her sleeping child in the cradle and went to welcome him. Afterwards, she insisted on my taking off my bonnet and having some tea, for she said I looked pale and tired. I was glad to accept her hospitality, and I submitted to be relieved of my travelling garb, just as passively as I used to let her undress me when a child. She wanted to know if I was happy at Thornfield, and what sort of a person the mistress was, and when I told her there was only a master, whether he was a nice gentleman, and if I liked him. I told her he was rather an ugly man, but quite a gentleman, and that he treated me kindly, and I was content. Then I went on to describe to her the gay company that had lately been staying at the house, and to these details Bessie listened with interest. They were precisely of the kind she relished. In such conversation an hour was soon gone. Bessie restored to me my bonnet, etc., and accompanied by her, I quitted the lodge for the hall. You shall go to the breakfast room first, said Bessie, as she preceded me through the hall. The young ladies will be there. In another moment I was within that apartment. There was every article of furniture looking just as it did on the very morning I was first introduced to Mr. Brocklehurst. The rug he had stood upon still covered the hearth. Two young ladies appeared before me, one very tall, almost as tall as my singrum, very thin too, with a shallow face and severe mien. There was something ascetic in her look, which was augmented by the extreme plainness of a straight-skirted, black-stuff dress, a starched linen collar, her hair combed from the temples, and the nun-like ornament of a string of ebony beads and a crucifix. This, I felt sure, was Eliza, though I could only trace a little resemblance to her former self in that elongated and colourless visage. I just want to interrupt real quick and say sorry if you hear the fan right now. It's very, very loud because my computer is old and dying. I'm really sorry about that. Anyway, let's continue. The other was certainly Georgiana, but not the Georgiana I remembered, the slim and fairy-like girl of 11. This was a full-blown, very plump damsel, fair as a waxwork, with handsome and regular features, languishing blue eyes, and ringleted yellow hair. The hue of her dress was black too, but its fashion was so different from her sister's, so much more flowing and becoming. It looked as stylish as the others looked puritanical. In each of the sisters there was one trait of the mother, and only one. The thin and pallid elder daughter had her parents' categorum eye. The blooming and luxuriant younger girl had her contour of jaw and chin, perhaps a little softened, but still imparting an indescribable hardiness to the countenance, otherwise so voluptuous and buxom. Both ladies, as they advanced, rose to welcome me, and both addressed me by the name of Miss Eyre. "How is Miss Read?" I asked soon, looking calmly at Georgiana, who thought fit to bridle at the direct address, as if it were an unexpected liberty. "Mrs. Read? Ah, mamma, you mean? She is extremely poorly. I doubt if you could see her tonight." "If," said I, "you would just step upstairs and tell her I am come, softly opened the door, and a shaded light stood on the table, for it was now getting dark. I approached the bed. I opened the curtains and leant over the high-piled pillows. The well-known face was there, stern, relentless as ever. There was that peculiar eye which nothing could melt, and the somewhat raised, imperious, despotic eyebrow. How often had it lowered on me menace and hate, and how the recollection of childhood's terror and sorrows revived as I traced its harsh line now. And yet I stooped down and kissed her. She looked at me. "Is this Jane Eyre?" she said. "Yes, Aunt Reed. How are you, dear aunt?" I had once vowed that I would never call her aunt again. I thought it no sin to forget and break that vow now. My fingers had fastened on her hand, which lay outside the sheet. Had she pressed mine kindly, I should at that moment have experienced true pleasure. But unimpressionable natures are not so soon softened, nor are natural antipathies so readily eradicated. Mrs. Reed took her hand away, and, turning her face rather from me, she remarked that the night was warm. Again, she regarded me so icily. I felt at once that her opinion of me, her feeling towards me, was unchanged and unchangeable. I felt pain, and then I felt ire, and then I felt determination to subdue her, to be her mistress in spite both of her nature and her will. My tears had risen, just as in childhood. I ordered them back to their source. I brought a chair to the bedhead. I sat down and laid over the pillow. "You sent for me," I said, "and I'm here. And it is my intention to stay till I see how you get on." "Oh, of course. You've seen my daughters." "Yes." "Well, you may tell them I wish you to stay till I can talk some things over with you I have on my mind. Tonight is too late, and I have a difficulty in recalling them. But there was something I wished to say. Let me see." The wandering look and changed utterance told me that wreck had taken place in her once vigorous frame. Turning restlessly, she drew the bedclothes round her. My elbow, resting on a corner of the quilt, fixed it down. She was at once irritated. "Sit up," said she. "Don't annoy me with holding the clothes fast. Are you Jane Eyre?" "I am Jane Eyre." "I am very ill, I know," she said ere long. "I was trying to turn myself a few minutes since, and find I cannot move a limb. It is as well I should ease my mind before I die. What we think little of in health burdens us at such an hour as the present is to me. Is the nurse here, or is there no one in the room but you?" I assured her were alone. "Well, I have twice done you a wrong which I now regret. One was in breaking the promise which I gave my husband to bring you up as my own child. The other—" She stopped. "After all, it is of no importance, perhaps," she murmured to herself. "Then I may get better, and to humble myself to her is painful." She made an effort to alter her position, but failed. Her face changed. She seemed to experience some inward sensation, the precursor, perhaps, of the last pang. "Well, I must get it over. Eternity is before me. I had better tell her. Go to my dressing case, open it, and take out a letter you will see there." I obeyed her directions. "Read the letter," she said. It was short, and thus conceived. "Madame, will you have the goodness to send me the address of my niece, Jane Eyre, and to tell me how she is? It is my intention to write shortly and desire her to come to see me at Madeira. Providence has blessed my endeavours to secure a competency, and as I am unmarried and childless, I wish to adopt her during my life, and bequeath her at my dear death whatever I may have to leave. I am, Madame, etc., etc., John Eyre, Madeira." which you affirmed that the very thought of me made you sick, and asserted that I had treated you with miserable cruelty. I could not forget my own sensations when you thus started up and poured out the venom of your mind. I felt fear, as if an animal that I had struck or pushed had looked up at me with human eyes and cursed me in a man's voice. Bring me some water. Oh, make haste. Dear Mrs. Read, said I, as I offered her the draught she required, think no more of all this. Let it pass away from your mind. Forgive me for my passionate language. I was a child then. 8, 9 years have passed since that day. She heeded nothing of what I said, but when she had tasted the water and drawn her breath, she went on thus. I tell you, I could not forget it, and I took my revenge. For you to be adopted by your uncle, and placed in a state of ease and comfort, was what I could not endure. I wrote to him. I said I was sorry for his disappointment, but Jane Eyre was dead. She had died of typhus fever at Lowood. Now, act as you please. Write and contradict my assertion. Expose my falsehood as soon as you like. You are born, I think, to be my torment. My last hour is racked by the recollection of a deed which, but for you, I should never have been tempted to commit. If you could be persuaded to think no more of it, and to regard me with kindness and forgiveness. You have a very bad disposition, said she, and one to this day I feel it impossible to understand. How, for 9 years, you could be patient and quiescent under any treatment, and in the 10th break out all fire and violence, I can never comprehend. My disposition is not so bad as you think. I am passionate, but not vindictive. Many a time, as a little child, I should have been glad to love you if you would have let me, and I long earnestly to be reconciled to you now. Kiss me, aunt. I approached my cheek to her lips. She would not touch it. She said I oppressed her by leaning over the bed, and demanded water. As I laid her down, for I raised her and supported her in my arm while she drank, I covered her ice cold and clammy hand with mine. The feeble fingers shrank from my touch. The glazing eyes shunned my gaze. Love me then, or hate me, as you will, I said at last. You have my full and free forgiveness. Ask now for God and be at peace. Poor suffering woman. It was too late for her to make now the effort to change her habitual frame of mind. Living, she had ever hated me. Dying, she must hate me still. The nurse now entered, and Betty followed. I yet lingered half an hour longer, hoping to see some sign of amity, but she gave none. She was fast relapsing into stupor, nor did her mind change again. At 12 o'clock that night, she died. I was not present to close her eyes, nor were either of her daughters. They came to tell me the next morning that all was over. She was at that time laid out. Eliza and I went to look at her. Georgiana, who had burst out into loud weeping, said she dared not go. There was stretched Sarah Read's once robust and active frame, rigid and still. Her eye of flint was covered with its cold lid. Her brow and strong traits wore yet the impress of her inexorable soul. A strange and solemn object was that corpse to me. I gazed on it with gloom and pain. Nothing soft, nothing sweet, nothing pitying, or hopeful, or subduing, did it inspire. Only a great anguish for her woes, not my loss, and a sombre, tearless dismay at the fearlessness of death in such a form. Eliza surveyed her patient calmly. After a silence of some minutes, she observed,